Welcome to the latest podcast from the Danube Institute in our series Danube Dialogues. Our guest today is Alexander Downerrel. Alexander Downerrel has been the longest serving foreign minister in Australian political history, and I suppose one of the longest serving foreign ministers in the last 20 or 30 years. He is a member of the Australian Liberal Party, the largest centre-right party in Australia. He has been leader of the party at various times. He is now, or was after he more or less left politics, the High Commissioner in London, the Australian High Commissioner in London, and he was in fact the son of a former High Commissioner, and grew up for much of his life in London. And I think you play an active part in a sense, world conservative politics. And my first question really is about the nature of the relationship between not only yourself, but between Australia and Britain and the other countries of what's called the Anglosphere. There was recently a programme here about Rupert Murdoch on British television. And Mary Kenny, the journalist, writing about it, said the second most fascinating thing about the programme, apart from Rupert Murdoch's personality, was the degree to which his enterprises spanned the Anglosphere and would probably not have been possible without the Anglosphere. What's your view on that, about the existence? What is the Anglosphere, and is it important?
Well, it is, of course, very important, although we frequently try not to talk too much about it for fear of causing offence to those countries that can never be part of it. But I think there are two components. I mean, prima facie, we're bound by a common language. Just because you speak the same language as someone doesn't necessarily mean you agree, but we're bound to be together by a common history, which explains our common language, and we're bound together by common values. And we're bound together by something a little bit more than that when it comes to intergovernment relations. We're bound together by trust. There's a degree of trust between those countries, which you won't find with any other country. So we have, for example, what is called the Five Eyes arrangement, which is an intelligence sharing arrangement between those countries. Well, you know, one of the almost unspoken but occasionally spoken rules of the Five Eyes is that we don't actually spy on each other. I wondered myself whether that was really true. Weren't the Americans surreptitiously breaching this and spying on us? But when the WikiLeaks and Snowden material was all published, I realised that the Americans weren't. And so we have intelligence exchanges, not just of the actual intelligence itself, but of intelligence officers working in each other's agencies. We have Australians working in MI6 and Brits working in the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, ASIS, and so with the Americans and the CIA and so on. So there is that great bond of trust which allows us even to share intelligence to the extent that we do. So this shows up in many aspects of life. When you're at a multilateral conference of one kind or another, as an Australian, you will find yourself invariably in agreement with the other English-speaking countries. Certainly with the British, in the case of Australia, I would say Great Britain was the most like-minded of all countries with Australia, even more so than New Zealand. Invariably, we are like-minded with the Americans, pretty much invariably with the New Zealanders. Canada is a little different. It goes through its woke phases. It's going through a very woke phase at the moment. So during that period, perhaps we are slightly less like-minded than we might be when there's a Prime Minister like Stephen Harper in situ.
Well, I think someone who's got a similar experience to you is our third member of the conversation, someone who I think will be your principal inquisitor, today, and that's Mark Higgy, a senior fellow here at the Danube Institute, but of course a former ambassador of Australia to both NATO and the EU, and of course to Hungary itself some years ago. Perhaps I could pass the baton to you, Mark, and if you'd take the burden of the conversation on, I'll intervene occasionally.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John and Alexander. Thank you so much. It's a great privilege to have you here today to get the benefit of your vast experience and insight. I thought we might start with Britain. Obviously, the preoccupation there in recent months has been this wretched pandemic, but we're moving rapidly towards a major milestone at the end of this year, which in some ways is even bigger than the beginning of this year, and that is the de facto exit from the European Union for Britain. And I was wondering what your feeling is about what that's going to look like. The signs recently have been, you'd have to say, pretty negative about the prospects of a free trade deal between Britain and the EU, particularly over the issues of EU insistence that Britain accept the EU rule book, as it were, adjudicated by the European Court of Justice, and fisheries, those two issues. But I'd be very interested in what your sense of how things are going and what we're likely to end up with come New Year's Day.
Well, I think, I can't be sure, but I think common sense will prevail and they will reach an agreement. So you're completely right. They're the two major sticking points, although in terms of the UK adopting EU standards and rules, they have agreed that that wouldn't be adjudicated by the European Court of Justice and that there'll be some separate arbitration process. But let's think about this logically. At the moment, the UK, being an island or series of islands, has an enormous exclusive economic zone, an EEZ, i.e. for fish. And 80% of the fish caught within the UK's EEZ are caught by EU fishing fleets. So they're worried, particularly the fishing fleets, therefore the governments of Spain, France, the Netherlands, they're worried that they won't be able to catch so many fish. And the British are saying, well, we're not continuing with the open fisheries policy that we have with the European Union. We're going to control the quotas ourselves in future. And the European Union is refusing to accept that. Well, if they don't reach an agreement with the UK, they'll end up with no fish. So common sense tells you that they'll have to bow to some compromise agreement. So on rules and regulations, I mean, the UK can't be expected, not being a member of the European Union, to have the European Union dictate all its rules, regulations, safety standards, animal welfare, and so on. That's just not going to happen. So if the European Union wants to sacrifice trade with the UK, and that doesn't mean just exports to the very large British market, but that means imports of things that traditionally they've got from the UK, including a lot of food. In that case, they're inviting a fair degree of disruption after the 31st of December. So I think common sense will prevail. I think they will strike an agreement, and I think by the end of September you'll see that they'll be a long way towards such an agreement. There'll be all sorts of fudges and compromises as there are in these things, but I would be pretty optimistic about it.
If common sense doesn't prevail in the end, how big a problem will that be for the UK, do you think? I'm thinking particularly of the heavy dependency of the UK on agricultural exports to the UK, something like 60 to 65%. And we all know about the still fiercely protective EU arrangements on imports of food products. So how bad would it be?
So outside of agriculture, I don't think it would be a major problem. I think that's much exaggerated. I think trade would continue pretty much as it does. I mean, you know, there'll be a 10% duty on imports into the UK of cars. If the UK wanted to apply that EU level of tariff, anyway, the 10% will apply in the opposite direction for UK car exports to the EU. 10%, I don't think that's going to have a big effect on the market. It would have some effect. So the problem would be food. 40% of food consumed in the UK is imported. Of course, that doesn't all come from the EU. So, I mean, you could still import it, but it'd be a lot more expensive. Again, if they applied EU rules and regulations, but the UK wouldn't have to do that. So they could import food with much lower tariffs and quotas and so on, although they would have to do so on a most favoured nation basis, which means they'd have to allow imports not just from the EU on that basis, but they'd have to allow imports from the rest of the world, including Australia. So over and above that, yes, the biggest problem for them, I think, would be their exports to the EU. There would obviously be a very big decline. They wouldn't be scrubbed out, but there would be a very big decline in their exports to the EU. Agricultural exports. That's what I mean. I'm being very specific. Food exports. But the EU needs the food. I mean, to suddenly cut off British beef or British lamb, or lamb's not perhaps such a big export, but all sorts of vegetables and so on. That would create substantial disruption in Europe. So I think they would find a way around that if the worst came to the worst. Even if it was on a temporary basis, I think they would come to some sort of introduce some sort of temporary measure to deal with it. But I don't think it's going to come to that. I mean, I think this. So when you think of a worst case scenario, they'll muddle through, and being realistic, they're likely to strike an agreement. So by the 1st of January, they will have completely left the European Union in not just name, but in fact.
Yeah. Comparing Britain's situation with Australia, over the past 30 years, Australia has been very successful negotiating free trade deals around the world, to the extent that we've got them with pretty much all our trading partners, except the EU. But they take a long time, even in the best of circumstances. Possibly an exception was our trade agreement with the United States. But what's your sense of how quickly Britain can move to secure deals elsewhere in the world to compensate with the end of the arrangements with the EU?
Well, they've pretty much concluded a negotiation with Japan, and so that there's still some details left, but that's I don't think going to be a particularly high quality agreement, but it's one that will at least bide them over, because the EU has an agreement with Japan, so they've basically taken that as the template and made some adjustments to it. So they've done that very quickly. They've done that in a couple of months. With Australia, it's the one I know the most about. There was a working group in place for a couple of years which didn't meet very often and didn't make a lot of progress. And that's because the British government hadn't made up its mind what it really wanted from a free trade agreement with any country. So in the first round of negotiations, which were a month or so ago, the Australian side said, well, look, basically free trade means free trade and we'd like to open up the market. And their response was, well, we understand that, but we might have some problems with agriculture and we'll have to work those through. So what do I think? I think given that they would really like to conclude free trade agreements with countries like Australia, they will conclude that relatively quickly. I mean, I would hope they could do it within the next year. The ministers, the Prime Minister and the ministers need to give more focus to what they're prepared to accept with a country like Australia. I mean, we know they're not going to abandon all of their agricultural protection for Australia overnight, but we would only want from them a commitment to phase it down. And I don't think we're going to have an argument with them, which many countries will, about issues such as regulatory standards, animal welfare, and SPS issues, sanitary and phytosanitary issues. I think that we should be able to very quickly come to an accommodation there, because Australia's standards are so stringent and so high. So I think, look, you're right. These negotiations can take a long time, but they only take a long time because governments want to carve out of free trade various protectionist measures. And I think with Australia, outside of agriculture, they'd probably be pretty keen to, press ahead with agreements on digitisation and services and so on, which are going to be really important. Sure, we could import Scotch whisky a little bit more cheaply, Bentleys and Range Rovers. We can knock the Australian tariff off those. It's not going to make a big difference to sales, I wouldn't have thought. If you can afford a Bentley, you can afford a 10% tariff on a Bentley, I expect. But I mean, there will be, in terms of goods trade, I think it should be pretty straightforward outside of agriculture. In terms of services, it will be. And the other area which will be very important is mutual recognition of qualifications. And I know that Australia obviously is keen to get that recognition. And apparently the British side is pretty keen to do the same. So it doesn't need to take too long.
Absolutely.
Could I ask a slightly broader version of the same question? Namely that going back to your remarks about the Anglosphere, if you're moving to trade agreements between the UK on the one hand and Australia, maybe the United States and Canada and so on, you're going to have an economic and trading relationship that is, so to speak, parallels Five Eyes and other national security arrangements. There's been, since the referendum was passed, a sense in British politics that we have to make a kind of a broader decision. Is the break with Europe going to be very limited and reparable, or are we going to move to a relationship with the countries of the Anglosphere? The popular term now is CANZA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, in which you wouldn't just have freer and more liberal trade, but maybe more liberal immigration arrangements. Because, interestingly enough, opposition to immigration in opinion polls appears to be virtually non-existent when you ask the question about these five countries.
Yeah, of course. Well, here am I, an Australian, talking to you from London. I'm a good example of an immigrant. I guess I'm a temporary one. I won't be here forever. But what do I think about that? I don't think we're going to have completely free movement with the UK. Speaking for Australia, and I think Canada and New Zealand would take that view as well. So what we're really suggesting to the British is something a bit more modest, but more palatable in any case to them and to us, and that is much freer movement for professional people, academics, business people, and so on. As we have with the Americans, we have which we negotiated at the same time as our FTA with the Americans, something called an E3 visa, which makes it very easy to go and live and work in America for just a couple of years, and then you can roll over your E3 visa twice. So you can stay there for up to 6 years, and then of course you can apply for permanent residency and citizenship. So I think we would be looking for something like that. We could do that with Canada. New Zealand, in Australia's case, we allow free movement of people actually from New Zealand already, and have done for many years. So I think not have completely free movement of people, but make some substantial steps forward. I personally, my advice to the British is not to throw away their relations with Europe. There's no point. They live on the edge of the European Union as it is, so there's no virtue in that. And geography tells you they should have a very strong relationship with the European Union. But they, what they have done since 1973 is turn their back on countries outside of the European Union and focused on the European Union. Even America has been, in many respects, downgraded with the exception of the Blair years, in many aspects of British diplomacy, at least by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, if not always by the Prime Minister of the day. And so they need to strengthen that relationship and build, as best they can, a free trade agreement with the Americans. I think they are something I've pushed on them very hard, and they've now embraced, is this quite ambitious plan for Britain to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, as it's formerly known. So this will bring the UK together with Australia and Japan and Canada and Mexico and some of the Southeast Asian nations in a largely free trade arrangement, which would be fantastic for the UK, but all the time having the continuation of free trade with the European Union. So I must admit, I think they have, if they can strike a deal with the European Union and maintain, they will maintain good and strong relations with many of the European countries and the EU institutions, they can do so much more in the rest of the world than they could being part of the European Union.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could move to another issue that's been bubbling away, I'd have to say fairly negatively for the Boris Johnson government, and that is, you mentioned free movement. This is the free movement of illegal immigrants on dinghies and kayaks across the Channel from the French coast to Britain. I saw the figure this morning of something like 3,200 so far this year, which is a not insignificant number, with no prospect apparently of this ending. Now, you were the Foreign Minister of Australia at a time when we faced similar challenges. What would your advice be to Britain about what to do about this?
Well, my advice to them has been quite straightforward. Let's face it, these people who originally come from countries like Afghanistan and Iran, Pakistan, Bangladesh, parts of Africa, particularly West Africa, these people claim that they need protection and that they're refugees. Well, excuse me if I point out that they're in France, and the French people and the French government is not persecuting these people. And given that they're in France, they shouldn't therefore be able to just migrate to the UK, come to the UK, and yet again claim to be refugees. They're not refugees from France. And so I would turn back the boats, as they say. And there are all sorts of legal questions that you would have to address in doing that. But the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, has been pretty tough, I think, in what she's been saying with the French, and then more joint operations in France to try to stop these people crossing. But I would just turn back their boats. That's what I would do. Once they realise they can't come to the UK, once they realise they can't come, well, most of them won't pay the people smugglers to bring them. But for as long as, the people smugglers are able to sell a ticket by saying that if you go to the UK, they won't send you back, you'll be fine there. And these are follow these legal processes. Well, they'll just keep coming. And they won't stop it. So, I'm not sure that it's enraged the British people, but in any case, it doesn't look very competent that they're allowing people to come in that way. And it's also relatively dangerous to be getting into a small rubber boat one of those Zodiac boats, rib boats, they sometimes call them, and crossing the English Channel. I mean, it can be okay on the right sort of a day, but it's very busy and it can get quite rough, so it's dangerous.
Well, that question, that issue leads me into a broader one, and that is that it does often seem, particularly from the perspective of being a member of the Australian Liberal Party, that the Tories seem to be somewhat to the left on many of the big issues that Great Britain faces, with the exception of Brexit, where Boris Johnson obviously has taken a Tory position. But if you look at not only immigration but climate change, ring fencing, aid spending, but not defence or the police. Some people argue that it's debatable whether the government for the past 10 years has been in any real and meaningful sense a Conservative government. What's your view of that issue?
It's a very good question. I think they vary, so it's hard to generalise, but they are very loath to engage in cultural debates, if I could call them that. They've basically been pretty straightforward on economics. So, and as it happens during the coronavirus crisis, they have been orthodox in terms of what Western governments, well, beyond Western governments, all governments have done. They've done very similar things to the Australian government. They basically profess the liberal market model. They are not really into bailouts for dying businesses and industries. And they have been fiscally more responsible, certainly than their Labor predecessors were, who were reckless with money. Of course, they're not being fiscally conservative now, but we all understand that's just a temporary measure, not a permanent change in political philosophy. They've reduced taxes quite substantially. So I think their economic agenda has been consistent with what you would expect from a Conservative government. But when it comes to social and cultural issues, they're very divided, actually. So on the sort of issues like diversity and inclusion, instead of the Conservative view, which is the sort of Martin Luther King position that you judge people by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin, the Conservatives have been quite substantially into programs like affirmative action. Well, they don't use the term affirmative action, but that's what they've been doing. Hate speech, all of those kinds of things have been criminalised in the UK. And you now find under the Conservatives that the police are spending a very substantial amount of their time dealing with these hate crimes of one kind or another, instead of more traditional law and order work. And this, I think, is you can say these laws were introduced by the Blair government, Blair and Brown governments, which is true. But the Conservatives haven't done anything about it. The police, for example, have become very politically correct. When it comes to appointments, the Conservatives have been extremely timid. They have appointed a lot of sort of what you might call liberal elites into key positions in places like the BBC, the police, into cultural institutions of one kind or another. Instead of ministers making the appointments themselves, they contract out that work because they don't want to be criticised for appointing Conservatives. Well, they are Conservatives, so why would they mind if someone criticised them for being Conservatives and appointing Conservatives? So I spent a bit of time on that. So I think, when it comes to issues like Black Lives Matter, you see the Metropolitan Police, some members of the Metropolitan Police taking the knee. Well, if I was the Home Secretary, I'd say, for God's sake, keep out of politics. That annoys an awful lot of people. People just roll their eyes. We're wondering what they should say. And there's an awful lot of political correctness in the Conservative Party that you wouldn't see in the Liberal Party in Australia. And they would look at us and tut, making jokes like that. That's not appropriate.
You're now the president in London of the Policy Exchange think tank, the leading conservative think tank in Britain. One of the problems you're facing, outlined by John Gray, not a conservative, but a very clear-sighted observer, is that the Tories won an unassailable majority in the election, but all of the institutions of society, the cultural institutions, the media, the universities, the bureaucracy, the quangos you were just talking about, are in the hands of the Liberal establishment. This is a very difficult problem. And now you've been given the task of trying to solve it, haven't you? Because that's what Policy Exchange is about today, more than anything else.
Well, it's about, it has many different projects, but I mentioned those points and you've reinforced them, John. I think they need to have a bit more courage to appoint people who are like-minded to key cultural positions. And it astonishes me. It astonishes me that they don't. I've even made this point to Boris Johnson himself, that you really need to make sure you don't let these cultural institutions continue to be dominated by the left. The people, I can't say the Liberal Party in Australia has had any success with the ABC in Australia. But at least during the life of the Howard government, we made a huge effort to appoint a whole lot of people who we thought might give it a better balance than it currently, then and currently has. But with the BBC here, it's basically somewhere between the Labor Party and the Greens, as is the ABC in Australia, and the Conservatives do nothing about it. They just do nothing about it. And it is true with so many of the other cultural institutions. So I don't know. I think it's a very important agenda for the Johnson government. You're quite right. They've got a huge majority, and they're frightened, of course, of elements of the media as well, which goes back to the BBC. If they appoint, John Smith, who was once a member of the Conservative Party, to some key cultural position, then they're worried that the BBC will, and newspapers from the left through to the Times, will attack them for cronyism. So they appoint people often who are quite hostile to the government. It's madness.
I was just going to say they could at least try to get the BBC to keep Andrew Neil. That I would have thought would have wide public support, but I suppose they can't intervene directly.
No, I think that's right. No, well, I think he wants to retire, doesn't he, Andrew Neil?
I think when he wants to retire, but not when they want him to retire. But there we are.
Just a footnote to the earlier question. And that is, as Foreign Minister, you were responsible for the international aid program for all those years. What's your feeling about what Britain's done with aid? Legislating for 0.7% of GDP every year. I looked at the figures the other day, and what Britain is doing is much more generous than any other of the big countries in Western Europe. That is higher than France, Germany, Italy, any of them. And it's certainly much higher than the rest of the Anglosphere and Japan. So, Britain has become a bit of a... it's out there on its own with this under a Tory government. What's your feeling?
Well, more than that, it was the Tories. Well, it was the coalition government, the Tories, Tories and the Lib Dems, when David Cameron was the Prime Minister, that legislated the 0.7%. Well, it's not just a target, it's mandatory. By the way, because of the collapse of the economy through the coronavirus crisis, they're going to reduce the aid budget by £2 billion this year. an estimated £2 billion. But they've been spending around 14,000 million pounds a year on foreign aid. What's my view about it? I said all the time I was the foreign minister, it's not how much you spend, it's what you spend it on that is the key issue. Try to understand why some countries are poor. And if you can understand that, which is, essentially a governance issue. It's nothing else. It's a governance issue. Not in 100% of cases, but in most cases. Well, then you need to help them improve their governance. And you need to look at mechanisms to do that. Of course, it's politically in those countries quite difficult. But you don't need to be pouring billions and billions and billions of pounds into foreign aid in order to improve the quality of governance. So the reason the Conservative government of David Cameron did this, or Conservative-led government of David Cameron did this, was they thought that it made the Tories, less brutal and less right-wing and less... Well, it certainly makes them look less right-wing to be spending £14 billion a year on foreign aid, because what it's really about, the reason that the target for the amount of money is set by the United Nations is it isn't about helping these countries per se, it's about wealth redistribution. So I think they should be honest about that. They should, if it's just that they want money redistributed from wealthy countries to poor countries, and that will make a fairer world, well, then they should lay it out like that. But by the way, it won't work. Even if you do that, it won't work, because if countries are badly governed, then no amount of aid is going to solve their problems. And countries have done incredibly well without foreign aid. Countries, like Korea and Singapore and so on. These countries weren't built on the back of foreign aid. They were built on the back of good governance. So I think their agenda is a bit wrong. But in any case, they're merging what's called DFID, the Department for International Development, with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, or they're incorporating DFID into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. To just create a behemoth, as has happened in Australia, when the same thing was done there. But whether that will improve the quality of aid, I very much doubt.
Yeah. I wonder if we should move on to China now. There's talk of a new Cold War. Do you think that's overstating it, the downturn?
Yes, I do think it's overstating it, but I think that the government in Beijing, the communist government in Beijing, needs to be a lot more careful with how it's handling the international community. They need to be more serious about upholding the rule of law, and that particularly takes us to the South China Sea and the East China Sea, where they have shown a cavalier disregard for international law, including totally rejecting the decision of the Permanent Court of Arbitration on the South China Sea. They need to tone down a lot of their rhetoric and these threats that they're making to Australia, to the UK, to a number of other countries. This threatening talk is having a completely counterproductive effect, where once the Western countries were quite divided over how to manage the relationship with China, some taking a harder line than others, and China was able to take advantage of those divisions. Well, you would, Mark, be very familiar with the divisions within the European Union over how to handle China. So what they've done is President Trump is not popular with the leaders of the other NATO countries or Western Alliance countries more generally. But what China has done is nevertheless drive all those countries much more closely together. And they're building closer collaboration now on how to manage the relationship between them and China. And I just don't think this has been thought through in Beijing. I think they've, taken the view that, we can end those protests in Hong Kong not by allowing the people of Hong Kong freely to elect their chief executive, but by doing the reverse, by imposing security laws from Beijing onto Hong Kong and thereby undermining the joint declaration, which is an international treaty. They have underestimated the reaction that there would be from Western countries, from the UK, but from Western countries more generally, to that sort of behaviour. So I think they're getting themselves into a very difficult position. They thought that they could solve all their problems with money, and I think we could tell them from experience that you can't. You can't bribe countries easily. You can't force countries to bow down before you by threatening to curtail trade with them. They will not respond positively to threats. Governments, countries will never respond positively to threats. So all of these threats have been very counterproductive, and a lot of their measures have been counterproductive as well.
I mean, do you really think that, I mean, what they did with Hong Kong, I mean, they basically trashed one country, two systems in relation to Hong Kong after 23 years when they said 50. They must have anticipated that this would get a pretty strong reaction around the world. Or do you think that they seriously misread the outside world and they underestimate these things?
Right. I think they have seriously misread the outside world. Seriously misread the outside world. They've become very confident. And I have no problems with that, them becoming self-confident. Cocky, really. But you know the old saying, pride comes before a fall. It's never that easy in the world of international diplomacy, even if you're America. And they have just overreached. They think because they have the world's second largest economy, they are, of course, the world's most populous country. They've built up a very strong military, small, of course, compared to the United States, but strong compared to most countries. They have come to the conclusion that they can throw their weight around. And of course they can to some extent, and I think everyone would recognise they need to have an appropriate place at the table of the great powers. But they've just overreached. They've just miscalculated. And who has done that, whether that's Xi Jinping himself or, you know, the Politburo or the Foreign Ministry, they're inevitably going to get a lot of pushback. And I think I made the point when the coronavirus crisis erupted and they started going feral about countries taking measures to contain the spread of the coronavirus from China, that this is a huge blow to China's soft power. And it is. It's not been a blow to its hard power, but it's been a huge blow to China's status in the world. So I think I've also been very interested going to a number of developing countries which are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so prima facie are going to benefit from a lot of Chinese investments in those countries. I've been surprised by the degree of resentment there is for the way China has handled those investments. I was in Uganda last year and they built a very much needed freeway from Kampala down to the airport. But it's interesting. There's no gratitude there in Uganda for that. They didn't like the way the Chinese did it. Chinese workers built the road. There was a sense that Ugandans didn't really benefit much from it. And, you know, they were just coming in and trying to buy their way into their country, if not buy their whole country. So I think, and I've spent a bit of time on this, I look at it a different way from most Western analysts who sort of think about, well, are we doing the right thing and what policies should we pursue? Well, that's true. We need to think about that. But I think Chinese have shown themselves to be very clumsy diplomats.
Could I ask a slightly longer term version of this question? The Chinese were brought into the world economic and political system really by Nixon first, and then by Reagan and Thatcher. And as a result of what they did, Australia benefited enormously. I mean, you had a hugely successful policy of maintaining a strong alliance with America and developing and deepening economic relationships with China. Now, people are beginning to sort of criticize that policy. It seems to me you can make the case that for a very long time it was the right policy. What changed was China. And now I ask myself, if you were Chinese statesman, or better yet really, if you were Lee Kuan Yew, who in a sense, whose advice was behind much of the previous sensible policy, what do you think Lee Kuan Yew would be saying today to the Chinese leadership?
Well, I think and by the way, I think your analysis is right. I think, even though I say so myself, I think the Australian policy on dealing with China from 1972 onwards was very well judged, and we did incredibly well out of it. And I mean, I think we're at a bad time in our bilateral relations with China at the moment. But on the other hand, having said that, I think we can hope that Chinese diplomacy starts to readjust and we can pass that time. What would Lee Kuan Yew say? Well, I think he would privately say to the Chinese, try to get on better. Try to get on better with your neighbours. Try to find more bonds to build with these countries. Try to be a little less aggressive in how you deal with them. So they had an issue, which was Hong Kong. I must admit, I wondered how they were going to solve that problem, but with the riots and the demonstrations in Hong Kong, I thought that they were wise not to send in PLA troops and so on. So they sent in spies. Well, that is as it is, and it'll always be. But I thought they were wise not to send troops across the border to try to stamp out the protests, just to use the Hong Kong police. And I thought time would heal the problem, but it might take time. And the Chinese are said to be patient, so they would wait it out. And I think that's what they should have done. And, Carrie Lam is obviously a very weak chief minister. And they need to, at some point, get somebody better into that job and somebody who can work with the Hong Kong community and is better respected in Hong Kong. But, it wasn't the time to sack her. So it really surprised me that they would take such a strong stand as they did and pass this security law. And they thought, I can see what they thought. They thought, well, that will fix the demonstrations. And by the way, it will fix the demonstrations because the penalties are absolutely, blood-curdling for breaching this law. And actually the application of the penalties would be very unpredictable. So I think it will fix the demonstrations. But in the process of doing that, they haven't really thought through the implications for their relations with the West. I think they probably thought, well, the British will cry out, but, so what? Whereas, in fact, they've ended up by paying quite a heavy price for this, and I don't think the bills are all in yet either. So it's a very good illustration of my point. I think Lee Kuan Yew would say to them, tread more carefully, because I'm a subscriber to Graham Ellison's Thucydides thesis, really, the Thucydides trap, that rising powers come up against status quo powers, and the most important single thing to do in geopolitics is to manage those relationships. And that means, in particular, managing the American-China relationship. But managing China's relationship with the West and the West's relationship with China. But that falls on two sides. The West and America in particular have to give China more space in recognition of its growing power and its economic success. On the other hand, China has to tread carefully and sensitively, and not overreach as powers have done before. You know, from Athens to Berlin, in 2,500 years. You've seen it. You've seen that overreach. The Spartans, who were the status quo power, they finally won, albeit at a huge cost. And the Germans lost, albeit the winners paid a huge cost as well, at an almost ruinous price. And so, China doesn't want to go down that path.
Another area where the Chinese have trodden anything but carefully is at the western end of the country with the Uyghur minority, and the details have been coming out which just sort of show what a horrendous the scale of the human rights abuse is quite extraordinary. And to me, one of the mysteries of international relations is that China has got away with this for so long, and in particular, why is it that Muslim countries don't make an issue out of this? It does seem quite extraordinary that they don't choose to highlight this issue, in contrast, say, to the way they talk about Israel. Do you have any particular insights into how that is? Why? I mean, looking at our region and Indonesia and Malaysia, and then you've got moderate states, relatively speaking, like Turkey or Jordan. I mean, why has China got away with this?
Well, I think the Beijing governments work really hard with those governments and the media in those countries to persuade them that these stories about maltreatment of the Uyghurs and concentration camps and so on, re-education camps, if you like, are wrong, and they're a fiction of the Western imagination. And I think to some extent they have been quite successful. By the way, it's not just Muslim countries. It's human rights groups in Western countries as well. They seem much less concerned about the Uyghurs than as you quite rightly say, than the Israelis. You could have an Israeli soldier hit a Palestinian youth who's throwing rocks at him with a rubber bullet in the knee and shatter his knee, and that will lead to protests outside the Israeli embassy. But China can send 1 million Uyghurs to a re-education camp, and that's not worthy of a demonstration. And it's the media as well. The media, which is dominated in the West, is dominated by the centre-left, really, or the left, dominated by the left. It's not all left, but it's dominated by them. It doesn't give much focus to some reporting, of course, but it's not an overwhelming issue in the way that Israel is, or plenty of other countries, which their human rights abuses are fashionable to attack, but it's not fashionable to attack China. And there's the power of China as well. They exercise that power. Presumably in Indonesia, they think, well, these stories may not be true. We don't really know. We don't want to get into a conflict with China over something like that. But, when it came to the Kosovars, the Albanian Kosovars, the Muslim world was up in arms about their treatment by Milosevic, and defies belief. But I mean, I'm old enough and experienced enough in politics, both international and domestic, to know that nobody seems to win much in the way of a prize for consistency, and certainly the media.
Absolutely. We're starting to run out of time, but don't want to let you go without getting your take on the United States. The comment's been made that the leftist extremism that was unleashed by the Black Lives Matter protests has been a gift to Trump. that given the slowdown in the economy, he could have been in serious trouble. Now, of course, the opinion polls continue to put Biden ahead. What's your sense of how things are going as we head towards the presidential election?
I think it'll be fairly tight. I mean, I think, first of all, Trump has a very big base, around 40% of the voting population. A lot of people say, well, he only has 40%. Well, I say 40%. That's a huge base to have. He's obviously been really hit by the coronavirus crisis, and the Black Lives Matter issue, I think, would very much play second fiddle to the coronavirus issue. And personally, I don't think he's handled the PR of that well at all. So, saying silly things at times, not looking as though he's taking it terribly seriously, then, contradicting himself in short periods of time. When the public didn't really know and are looking for national leadership. I mean, a lot of the actual measures are taken by the state governments and are the responsibility of the state governors. But how is it that New York State is one of the worst affected, well, certainly was initially the worst affected of all states? And Donald Trump was condemned for this, and the governor of New York, Cuomo, was proclaimed as some kind of a hero when it's his measures predominantly which were required to address the problem. So Trump shouldn't have allowed that to happen. He shouldn't have allowed the onus of criticism to be switched from the state governor to him. So I think he's handled it badly in political terms. But I don't know, when the election comes, and it's only about 97 or 8 days away now, Joe Biden is going to have to come out of his basement and he's going to have to engage in public debate. And the little I've seen of his public performances, other than his set-piece performances, I think for the Democrats, they'll be a real worry. He's waffly, he's uncertain, he gets lost in the middle of sentences. I don't think it looks good. And, he's 77 going on 78. So there'll be a focus on whether this guy is too old for the job, really. I mean, if he becomes the president, he'll become the president at the age Ronald Reagan gave up the presidency. Slightly older, I think. Was Ronald Reagan 70 when he became the president? It might have been 69. But in any case, I think it's far from over. I think it'll be very interesting to see. And, it's an electoral college system and it's voluntary voting. So, it depends what happens in the battleground states. I mean, Biden is ahead in most of the battleground states, but not as far ahead as he is in the national polls, which, if you take the Real Clear Politics poll of polls at the moment, is about 9%. But anyway, we'll see. I think a strong Democratic candidate would have won the election easily, actually, because I think... So the thing about Trump is a lot of his policies have been very good, but a lot of his tweeting and partisan slagging and so on, it's not for a president to behave like that, I don't think, and that's damaging to him. So some people won't vote for him for that reason. But I don't know, Biden is a weak candidate.
I'm sure you're right about people's attitude to Biden and Trump, but I can't help asking this question. Isn't there going to be a new political status quo in America, whatever the result? Because if Biden wins, he'll be a new president with a new Secretary of State, Defense Minister, probably a new Democratic majority in the two houses of Congress. On the other hand, if Trump wins, he will actually be the president maybe almost for the first time, because there won't be any moral basis for the continuing kind of bureaucratic and legal resistance to almost anything he proposes to do?
No, I'm afraid that won't happen. I think with George W. Bush, when he won, and the Democrats, because they always say it's not fair when they lose, but when he won, and poor old Al Gore, I mean, what were we spared there? Poor old Al Gore went down. And the hanging chads and all of that. I mean, the fact is that the result was the result and fairly counted. So it was said that if George W. Bush gets re-elected, then people will, accept the legitimacy of his presidency. Well, he did get re-elected. No, they just continued to howl at him, and there was intense partisanship and, endless attacks on George W. Bush. So I think if Donald Trump wins again, it will be, he cheated and it's not fair, and we've got to change the system, and, we can't allow people like this to win elections, and then they will be the same resistance. I mean, if he wins again, there'll be 1 or 2 Supreme Court appointments. Expect the nominee to be absolutely trashed, whoever the nominee is, no matter how bipartisan the nominee is and how well qualified. Expect a repeat of what we saw a couple of years ago. So I think America, it strikes me with Americans when I meet them, of course you can't go there now, but America has become intensely partisan. It's quite intense, the partisanship there. If Donald Trump said that the sun tomorrow will rise in the east, I predict the sun will rise in the east and it will set in the west, there would be absolute uproar from the left, saying this is an astonishing statement and appalling, and I just can't believe. I'm sorry, this is what it's reduced. So no, it doesn't matter what Donald Trump says, it's always bad and always wrong, and it's an outrage. And I remember during the Howard government how the left, which I think, Mark would agree was a government that did a pretty solid job for our country, that the left had a line then that I'm ashamed to be an Australian. Well, I used to say, well, you should leave Australia in that case and go and live in Venezuela or somewhere where you're more in tune with the regime. Personally, I would be ashamed to be a Venezuelan.
Well, perhaps I could ask a question to wrap things up, since I think we have reached the time to end it. And that is the Brits often say about their own country that Britain punches above its weight. Whether or not that's true, it seems to me that Australia does punch above its weight, because after all, it is a medium-sized country, and it has managed to be involved successfully in the main in most of the conflicts, and has come out ahead of the game, and it's enjoyed 20 or 25 prosperous years. Now, the question is, if I'm right, why is this the case? What explains the success of Australia in international politics?
Well, success brings its own rewards, I think, is the answer to your question. If you do things well, people will respect it. I agree with what you say about the UK. I think it's fair to say, so it's worth looking at this whole concept of soft power. And that is influence and the respect the country has. The reason the UK is so respected and has so much soft power is because it's been so successful in so many different fields. Has a stellar record in terms of things like scientific research, the quality of its universities, the impartiality of its judicial system, its continuing commitment to democracy and human rights. Civil liberties, a record on civil liberties almost unequaled around the world. Well, in the end, people in the streets of Nairobi or Kabul or Tokyo or Caracas look at a country like that and think, well, they in an overall sense, not just in a per capita GDP sense, they do very well. Well, if you look at Australia, it you know is a pretty and sunny continent. It has a stellar economic record. It is politically incredibly stable. It's the world. I mean, you think of Australia as being a relatively new country. Not really. Australia is the world's 6th oldest continuously operating democracy. It has only 25 million people. It's the 13th or so biggest economy in the world. Its per capita GDP is about the 5th biggest. So, you know, by any measure, so it has an independent judiciary. You know, you can count on even not saying too much about the Victorian Court of Appeal, but which has had so many of its decisions overturned by the High Court. But overall, it has a reputation for a fair and impartial judiciary. That's very important. I think there's an advantage in being an English language country. It means that you know English is the lingua franca of the world now, like it or loathe it, and therefore in the arts and culture, Australia has a natural advantage because, you know, if it makes movies, they're in English, so automatically has potentially a huge audience for those movies. So it's just success that has led to Australia having. I mean, if you look at there's a body here in the company here in the UK that produces an index every year of soft power, and the United States is always top. Its ratings have slipped, of course, a bit in recent years. And the UK is always second, and Australia is always in the top 10. Because people look to Australia and think, well, there's a sensible place, there's sensible people, they do things pretty well. We don't do things the best, and when they make mistakes, they sort of fess up to them and try to do things differently.
Well, as someone who's observed Australia from afar, but also lived there for 3 very happy and productive years, I share the view that Australia is a special kind of place. But thank you very much, Alexander Downer, Mark Higgy. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you.